I said something along the lines of, well, we got reports of shots fired. I could hear they were trying to call checkups on Officer Glover, and he wasn't responding his radio.
And then we stayed there until he passed. And after, it wasn't long, probably a few hours after they had removed some life support that he passed.
First off, I talked to Teresa Lyons, the grandmother of Audrey Jones, who raised him and considers him more of a son. She now lives in the Youngstown area, and she says she's not familiar with the Free Audrey Jones website, but she says she supports anything that will help free her grandson, whom she says is innocent. Dave DePofi, retired Prosecutor Sartini, and others are just as convinced Jones is guilty and the punishment is just.
I was there for the trial. As far as saying that, obviously every criminal who gets caught is going to say that their defense is botched. That's the nature of the beast. I don't know how you can say that it was botched multiple times, because if you look, Audrey has had multiple appeals, and those multiple appeals have been denied. So even if his original defense were botched, at what point in time, he's 2 appeals away from, fulfilling his sentence. There's obviously teams of lawyers who are attempting to get him a new trial or a reduced sentence who aren't. So, obviously, if it were obviously a botched defense, at some point in time an appeals court would admit that.
In 17 years, I've had to handle an awful lot of cases, a lot of murder cases, and a lot of them were very strong evidence, but I don't think I ever had a cases where the evidence was as strong as it was in this case.
I'm absolutely certain that the facts of the case indicate, one, he was tried by a jury of his peers, and he was found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. There was an eyewitness to the crime, a civilian eyewitness, not related to law enforcement, who was at a second floor window or opening from a home, who watched him do it. There was an officer at the time who apprehended him, and all the evidence put together, the forensic evidence, the eyewitness evidence, the crime scene evidence, indicated that he was guilty of killing Officer Glover. There's no question in my mind that he's guilty.
So what kind of a guy was William Glover?
He was a great guy to work with. He was always there when you needed something. You can ask him to do anything and he would do it. There were times where when we were all hired on together, there was 3 of us, myself, him, and John Koski. We were all hired on around the same time. We were assigned to the Asheville metropolitan housing areas. He was real friendly with the children down there. They always, when he pulled up, they always came running to his car, and there were times where he would used to pass out candy. And prior to him working with the city, I worked with him out in the village of North Kingsville. He was there for a period of time before he left there to go to become the chief out of Roaming Shores. It was sad what happened, and I remember that day, and something I'll never forget.
Everybody liked the guy. He was just a very likable guy. I didn't work many years or anything. I didn't work with him for that long, just the time that he was with the department, but worked with him enough to know that he cared about the kids. That was always first in his mind. I saw him out there shooting baskets with him down at the Metro Estates basketball courts, and I would see him pass out candy to the kids. He always had candy in the car, and he's always just talking about the kids and stuff that he'd met down there. Always was really helpful, and and he didn't hesitate to help other officers out if they needed assistance. He was always right there. Just genuinely a good guy, hard-working guy, and very thoughtful person. And that's what I remember about him, is he was just genuinely a good person.
William Glover's life and tragic death had a big impact on those who knew him. His buddy, Dave DePofi, for example, eventually quit law enforcement to open a Mexican restaurant in Conneaut.
If you're asking if Bill's death had anything to do with it, absolutely. Absolutely. Had that not happened, had he still been around, we obviously would have been continuing our friendship, and whatever, doubts that creep in or pursuits that you want to go after, they're always tempered by the people that you're around, the people that you're closest to.
Mm-hmm.
And he certainly would have been one of those people that I would have
He may have talked you out of it.
He may have. He may have. His goal was, like most of ours, is to rule the world, and it was always, someday we'll be sheriff, or someday, I'll be chief, or someday, and that was always the goal for all of us, was to reach the top, and bring everyone else with them.
He ran right in front of my car with a gun in his hand that at this point was no longer loaded because he had fired off all his shots. That easily could have been me had he had an opportunity to reload or still had more bullets in the gun. That did cross my mind. That I was lucky because all he had to do was turn around and I was sitting there in my police car. He could have easily shot me as well while I was sitting there. So it put a lot of things into perspective for me as a young officer. That's no matter how many times people tell you, this is not a game out there. This is serious business. You don't always realize that.
Did you
until
kind of
something happens.
change the way you did things after I think
It
a
did.
little bit more? When you
It
were out?
did. I took things a lot more seriously at that point in my career. As a very young guy, just they're chasing bad guys was fun, and then and then I realized at that point, it's like, what, this is no game. This isn't fun, and I used more caution from that point forward. I didn't necessarily go after people by myself so much if I could help it. If I knew somebody had a warrant, I waited for my backup to arrive as a result of this incident that took.
Glover's widow, Marianne Waldman, has been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, once called shell shock or battle fatigue syndrome. WebMD describes it as, quote, a serious condition that can develop after a person has experienced or witnessed a traumatic or terrifying event in which serious physical harm occurred or was threatened. PTSD is a lasting consequence of traumatic ordeals that cause intense fear, helplessness, or horror, such as a sexual or physical assault, the unexpected death of a loved one, an accident, war, or natural disaster. Families of victims can develop PTSD, as can emergency personnel and rescue workers. Here are her remembrances of the night Glover was shot, in her own words. I remember that night when we were at ACMC prior to Billy being life-flighted to Cleveland. I remember getting out of the police car and being met by Captain Pat D'Angelo. I remember him telling me Billy had been shot. In my mind, I knew that it would be okay, though, because Billy always wore his vest. I asked where he had been shot, and I was told. I think that is the moment I went into shock and just started functioning on stress mode and not allowing sincere comprehension of the matter. The first thing I did was ask whomever I talked to get Dave DePofi and Eric Gillespie contacted as soon as possible, as they were his best friends and I wanted them there with me. What seemed like seconds later, they were there. I remember seeing Billy and the nurse telling me to talk to him. He could hear me. I remember D'Angelo coming into the small room where we had assembled and telling me the doctor said it was a survivable injury, that he was being life-flighted to Cleveland, and that I would be taken by police car to Cleveland, 50 miles away. Blue lights and sirens, me, 2 Jefferson officers driving, Dave and Eric all in this car. The interstate had been blocked off and there wasn't a car on the road the entire way. Every now and then I would see an officer and an exit salute as we whizzed by with sirens blaring. We arrived in what felt like moments. The media frenzy gathered to catch a glimpse of me and trying to get the story. I had an amazing wall of officers from Cleveland, Ashtabula, Conneaut, and Jefferson surrounding me, trying to keep me hidden when I needed a cigarette. That happened only once, and then they wouldn't let me outside again. So here I was, smoking in the stairwell of a hospital. I'll never forget the neurosurgeon coming and telling me, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Glover, but your husband is going to die. We can't save him." I screamed at him, told him he was wrong, that the doctor in Ashtabula said it was a survivable injury. It was like a nightmare in slow motion. I called Billy's parents. I called my father. And even as I spoke the words, "he's going to die," I just couldn't grasp the reality. I tended to Billy, leaving his side only to smoke. I changed his bandages. I asked the nurses to help me cover up the horrible wounds so he would look better when his parents arrived from Virginia. Bag after bag of blood, bag after bag of platelets poured into his body, just trying to keep him alive. His face had swelled 3 times its normal size. I remember one eye slightly opening and a tear rolling down his face. I yelled for the nurse, "See, he can hear me. He is alive." Little did I know that it was the swelling causing it. I remember the conversation and decision to take him off life support. I knew I was going to, regardless what anyone wanted, because that was his wish. But I included his parents so they would think they had a say. He still lived for a few hours after we stopped all measures. Blood began to run fast from his wounds, pooling on the floor beneath the bed. His breath slowed, and I actually fell asleep listening to the sound of air being forced in and out of his lungs and his heart beating, and then Dave woke me. The time has come, and within a few minutes, Billy left this earth and my world was shattered. At another time, Mary Ann said, "Audrey took the life of Billy for one reason and one reason only, because he could. And when the time comes, I intend to be there to ensure I watch him executed, because I can." But will Glover's widow have that chance? After all of this time, will Audrey Jones be executed? It's a question I posed to Tom Sartini.
Essentially, all his appeals have been exhausted. He's filed some additional motion. He's starting to file a bunch of stuff on his own. And he's just throwing as much stuff against the wall as he possibly can, and requesting records and all of this, just the delaying tactics and just playing games with the system is all he's doing. The clock is ticking. It's been almost 18 years. I don't know what the average time in Ohio is, but it's getting close. And so he's alive because the system allows him to be alive for this length of time. Unfortunately, I think that because he's had all his appeals, the case has been looked over by the state courts, the Ohio Supreme Court, federal district courts. I'm sure he's tried to get into the federal appeals court. Well, I'm certain he will be executed unless the Supreme Court abolishes the death penalty or something like that.
Which has happened.
Which has happened, and I think it would be very unfortunate, because it's this kind of case, the worst of the worst case, that the death penalty is appropriate.
It's easy to look at a town like Conneaut, or even Ashtabula, Andover, Orwell, and say, oh, it's just a small town, or it's how bad could it be? There are things that every police officer in this county sees that they wouldn't wish on their worst enemy, and you carry that with you your whole life. And at some point in time, everybody has to sit down and realize, how much more do I want to go through? How much more do I want to see? Is it worth it to me? Is it worth it to my family? Because each one of our families, puts up with all of this as well. And everything that happens to us or everything that we do reflects on them. And everybody makes their individual choices.
It was sad what happened, and I remember that day, and something I'll never forget.